World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. And our motto of the day is, beware the Ides of March. This is extended to the hapless IMF-Yatsenyuk, who confabbed with Barack Obama yesterday, that is to say the 13th of March at the White House. Today is the 14th of March. Tomorrow, the 15th, the Ides of March. They're upon us. And then on the 16th, the referendum on whether Crimea will join the Russian Federation. And given the fascist gang in Kiev, and given the brutal, genocidal austerity that's being dished up by the International Monetary Fund and obediently swallowed by the puppet Yats. So he's got the U.S. fascist economic input, and then he's got his fascist base with the Svoboda and the right sector, the Yarosh Muzichko gang. This is something you want to stay away from. And of course, given those two factors, given the fascism and given the IMF austerity, anybody in his right mind is going to vote to join the Russian Federation. What choice is there? And I would do that. That's quite independent of whether you're a Ukrainian ethnic or speaker or Russian or Turkmen or Tatar or anything. This is simply beyond the pale. So beware the Ides of March. That's our advice to Yatsenyuk. Now, this morning, Lavrov and Kerry have been meeting in London, and this is already a cave-in by the U.S. because you remember that earlier in the week, Kerry said, "Well, we can't engage in contact talks, and we can't engage in any talks unless and until the Russian Federation accepts our entire concept of what's going on and the legitimacy of the government and the illegitimacy of a referendum and the sacred borders of Ukraine and so forth." Somehow the borders of Serbia were not sacred, but the borders of the Ukrainian state, now that it's under the control of these fascists, this is now sacrosanct. So Kerry had to cave on that one because that was simply unbelievable, that you won't talk unless you get all your preconditions satisfied. So Lavrov, in the course of this, referred once again to the deal of the 21st of February, which was sponsored by 3 NATO foreign ministers and which was then promptly junked. And for the Russian position is that deal, which called for the disarming of the fascist mob of Maidan, well, that's still in force, and it's not being fulfilled. And what do you say to that, Kerry? Now, at a deeper level, the big danger. There is a group called Anonymous Ukraine, and Anonymous Ukraine have gotten a hold of various emails, and these are highly interesting. This is a group of hackers, and they say they lament the fact that Anonymous worldwide is split between those who want to take the Abby Martin route, that is to say, subservience to the State Department and cringing regurgitation of the U.S. foreign policy line. There's a group in Anonymous that wants to do the Abby Martin routine in that regard. But then there's also a group that wants to defend the actual interests of people in Crimea and indeed Ukraine and the entire region. And they have put out emails between Klitschko, the punch-drunk Palooka, who's been excluded now by Newland and Company from the government, and the envoy of Lithuania, who was functioning as a representative of NATO. So those are very interesting, right, with Klitschko providing his bank information so that deposits can be made to his account, presumably. But the most urgent and immediate thing is hacked emails that show that these are alleged emails, right? And their validity would have to be investigated, but looks quite plausible. And this theme, whether these emails are plausible or not, this theme is highly relevant because this is exactly what you'd expect NATO to do. So what they show is the U.S. military attaché in Kiev, Colonel Jason P. Gresh, Gresh, writing emails to a figure in the Ukrainian military. This would be Colonel Igor Protsyk, Protsyk. You get all you get the leads to these, the links to these at my Twitter feed, Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Right? Get that Twitter coming in. You'll know all these things in advance. When things move fast, it's got to be through Twitter that we keep the public informed. So the Deputy Military Attaché, Lieutenant Colonel Jason P. Gresh, who's got a State Department email, on the March 9th, writes an email to Colonel Igor Protsyk, the head of the Commission for Bilateral Military Cooperation of the Ukrainian Army. And the text goes like this. This is the text released by Anonymous Ukraine. Igor, the events come thick and fast in the Crimea. Our friends in Washington expect decisive action by your network. I think it is time to implement the plan which we recently reviewed. Your task is to cause some problems to the transport hub in the southeast, to provide the neighbors a trap. This will provide for the Pentagon and the company, CIA, favorable conditions for action. Do not waste time, my friend. Sincerely, Jason P. Gresh, U.S. Army. Now, whether that's authentic or not, and you might say, well, that doesn't sound very idiomatic. Is that really how these characters talk? Maybe there are some doubts about that. But this is absolutely the thing that people should be thinking about. So, Gerhard Wisniewski, my old friend at gerhardwisniewski.de, der Wahrheit auf der Spur. He's always on the track of truth. He put this out, and this is a public service because this is the theme. This is exactly what's on the agenda. And then we have this is now translated back. Protsk writes to a certain Vasil Krivonis and says it's time to attack a Ukrainian airfield, specifically Melitopol. The air transport brigade is there, and it's time to stick it to those awful neighbors of ours. And he then gives various instructions. All right. Put that out far and wide. Go to tarpley.net, please. You can find, or you go directly to the Twitter account, but the tarpley.net carries the Twitter account, right? These are actually merged and have been now for some months. You can see a series of emails from me about what Anonymous Ukraine has been up to, especially with this false flag operation. And one of the things in the emails is that Colonel Gresh, Lieutenant Colonel Gresh, is concerned that this happened fast. He seems to want it to happen before the 15th of March, and that would mean to get something going in time for the referendum on the 16th. So this is highly plausible as a concept and deserves everybody's attention, and spread it, because these are the issues to discuss. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Broadcasting, this program will air for the first time on the 15th of March, 2014, the Ides of March. And that's for Yatsenyuk, right? You might say, Jan Yatsenyuk hath a lean and hungry look. He's an austerity ghoul. He was actually born near the Romanian border, so some influence of Count Dracula is not to be ruled out. Lavrov and Kerry in London this morning have agreed to, agreed to disagree. This was simply, I think, an application of Richelieu's famous dictum: it's good to negotiate with everybody all the time, under whatever circumstances. You always learn more, you always make yourself stronger if you negotiate. We want to keep the question of the false flag prominent. This is absolutely plausible at this time. Now, in terms of what's ahead, overnight and in the past couple of days, we've had these disorders in cities of the eastern Ukraine, which are not part of the Crimea. This is the famous Donetsk Donbass. And I must say, when I was in grade school already, I was tremendously impressed by the industrialization of this area. This went from something that was not that significant to being one of the greatest concentrations of coal and steel anywhere in the world. And that was done under the Soviets. That was done under the 5-year plan, under Stalin. And without that, it might have been impossible to prepare for the onslaught of Hitler. And therefore, this area is essentially populated by ethnic Russians. Now, in cities like Donetsk, there's also Kharkov. There's Dnepropetrovsk, I think with the large dam. Lugansk or Luhansk in Ukrainian. All of these places have had various kinds of altercations between the largely Russian population and the representatives of these blood-sucking oligarchs that have been sent in. One of the oligarchs who has been sent in is somebody who's got a reputation for essentially junking, right, for asset stripping various parts of Poland. And he obviously wants to do this in this tremendous industrial concentration of Donetsk and the Donbass, the Don Basin. So there's a great desire not to let him do that. There's a regional austerity, a regional looting, a regional asset stripping, which is planned for this area, right? They're going to be targeted especially, right, compared to some other areas. And 1 or 2 people were killed overnight in Donetsk. Now, if chaos and above all violence against Russian ethnic Russians, Russian citizens, Russian speakers is allowed to go on, then that of course gives an occasion, in some ways generates the need for the Russian army to step in. This is nothing new. International law has always had this feature that if there's chaos along your border, if the neighboring country is descending into chaos, then your forces are authorized to intervene to restore order, to restore law and order. But they generally say to restore order. And this has been cited many, many times. If the Ukrainian government is so impotent and so hated that it cannot make its writ run in those cities that we've just mentioned, then somebody will have to step in and provide law and order. And this, of course, would be another point for hysterical outbursts by the Western imperialists. But I urge people, do not surrender to that kind of lunatic stuff. One who has obviously gone off the deep end is the pitiful Madame Merkel of Germany. She gave a tirade in the Bundestag the other day, essentially saying, I feel threatened, right? You can imagine her singing, I feel threatened, to the tune of I Feel Pretty from West Side Story. I feel threatened, oh, so threatened. Maybe we can work on that, right? She feels threatened, and she says that one of the words that pops out in the speech is catastrophe, that a catastrophe might occur? On the level of German public opinion, if you check the German papers to try to find out something about this, you'll find that the big issue in Germany is a guy called Hoeneß. Hoeneß being the head of the FC Bayern soccer team, the Munich soccer team, which has done very well lately. They generally win. It was news when they only tied the other day. But this character has withheld 20 to 30 million euros of taxes. So this is now the big issue in Germany. But the Merkel question is that she has always been a fool, quite frankly, because her entire base, industrialists, small and medium industry, Mittelstand, the people in the Ruhr, the people who export, they are not interested in this U.S., British-generated human rights demagogy, right? The Samantha Power stuff is not of importance to them. They want good economic relations with Russia. And she is threatening that now with her hysterical outburst. I would point out to Merkel, if Putin had created a puppet state in Austria, right? We might say Austria, a rough comparison, Russia, Ukraine, Germany, Austria, right? Similar language, same language, have been united, have been separated. Or suppose Putin offended Hollande by taking over Belgium, right? Same story, right? Same language, similar language, have been united, have been separated at different times. Or suppose Putin took over Portugal, right? And that would freak out Rajoy in Madrid. Again, similar language, have been united, have been separated, and so forth. What I'm trying to stress is that what Putin is doing is overwhelmingly defensive. If you have a fascist coup in a state bordering the Russian Federation, you can't expect that this is simply going to be allowed, because this, of course, is the historical avenue of invasion and conquest, from Napoleon to Hitler, now to Samantha Power and Victoria Nuland. Oh, my God. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So it's the Ides of March 2014. Watch out, Yatsenyuk, Kanibok, Yarosh, and company. The handwriting is on the wall. And as for Madame Merkel, I was actually going to play you the famous Last Exit to Brooklyn by Gene Pitney from half a century ago now. They all talk about off-ramps. The people who need off-ramps are Kerry, Obama, Merkel, and the rest of them. And I still think that there will be significant resistance to this adventure, this lunatic policy and anarchist policy of economic sanctions that will extend everywhere. And these demagogic Poles who think that they can get by and that they can carry out the orders coming from Washington and London, they will find that it's not the same. And even in London, a significant backlash, as people have been pointing out, right? The entire real estate market, art market, Sotheby's, Christie's, all the rest of that, that's all Russian oligarchs. So watch out what you do. However, the question now is the International Monetary Fund. And it's well known that the International Monetary Fund, and I'm reading here from the Washington Post of today, Friday, March 14th, the IMF is expected to insist that the government allow the Ukrainian currency, the hryvnia, to float more freely, to remove subsidies on domestic gas prices that drain the budget and encourage waste. Oh, the siren song. We've heard this in Cairo, right? Get rid of those bread subsidies. Same story with Gaddafi, same story with Assad. No subsidies on fuel, cooking oil, bread, basic commodities. And the IMF is getting set to prepare its letter of intent, or it's the Ukrainian regime, right? The Fascistos in Kiev, the Yatsenyuks, that's what he's been put in there for, right? Yatsenyuk, central banker, austerity ghoul, is going to enforce this stuff. And he said so. It's going to be very harsh. It's going to be a kamikaze operation. Let's look into this for a second. The anti-corruption, of course, will be included. Now, let's see what we can find out about these IMF conditionalities, right? The demands that they're going to make on Ukraine, and what that looks like at the present time. And here's what it is. We got this has now been revealed by the Deputy Prime Minister of Crimea. Now, this is a pro-Russian woman, Olga Kovitidi, Kovitidi. Once again, the link is at tarpley.net and Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. She has leaked a document, which obviously was somehow circulated, and she says this is what the IMF is demanding, and what Kiev is now going to, take this dictation and then send it back. So here's what it looks like. She says it's predatory. Predatory is very mild. This is unbelievable. This is actually what you could imagine and what did happen when the Wehrmacht, right, when the Nazis took over Ukraine, how they looted the place, right? It's very, very similar. There's no exaggeration in saying that this is Nazi-like austerity. I'm sorry. Shouldn't offend anybody to say there is a direct historical parallel. So the tentative agreement, IMF and Ukrainian Yatsenyuk regime, as of March 2nd, the entire gas pipeline system of Ukraine will be handed over to Chevron Oil for nothing, as the mafia would say, for free. The entire gas pipeline system. Now, these are three principal large pipelines that take natural gas from Russia and transfer it into Western Europe. Now, there is that Nord Stream, which delivers a significant quantity of natural gas down the bottom of the Baltic, right, from Russian territory to Germany. Here, the Ukrainian fascists cannot do anything. And as a matter of fact, the Nord Stream is a direct response to the sabotage activities of these Ukrainians, essentially Timoshenko, in the past. But there are still three big pipelines that go through, and all of that is just going to be given to Chevron. Then this complex that I've talked about, the Donetsk Donbass, the steel mills of Dnepropetrovsk, and the coal industry of the Donbass, Donetsk Donbass, according to Kovitidi, she says that this is going to be given to the Ruhr AG. I guess this is Ruhr Kohle, right? Ruhr Coal Corporation of Germany. The 50% of its controlling stakes in those are simply going to be given to Germany, right? So that's their share of the cut. And the coal. So the steel and the coal are going to be transferred to Ruhr, partially through the Ruhr subsidy in Finland. This is coming through Interfax. Now, let's just stick to the economics. In terms of abolishing these subsidies, the gas prices for companies, for city-owned companies, will be increased by 50%. Yeah, but if you're in your house and you need natural gas to heat your house and to cook with, the price on that will double. Unbelievable. So the price of gas doubles. How about electricity? The electricity bill goes up by 40%, and that includes electricity which is sold en bloc to apartment houses, right, where you don't get an individual bill. Gasoline excise tax goes up by 60%, 60. The fares on public transportation go up by 50%. And true to the IMF, the prenatal care, right, in this dispatch it's called state support for childbirth. It means prenatal care for expectant mothers and then support for the actual delivery. That's going to be ended. Finish. And so far, in many cases, textbooks in schools are free. That will be ended. The rural Ukraine has been partially exempted from the value-added tax. That's going to end. They're going to have to pay the full tax. And value-added tax will be placed on medicines, which will increase prices and bring down the standard of living, according to Kovitidi. Now, the farmland. Right now, the ownership of farmland is frozen. There's a moratorium on the sale of farmland. Appalling, as she says now, what they're going to do. This is the Black Earth region, right? Ukraine, potentially the breadbasket of Europe and far beyond. Black Earth, great soil. This is now going to be freed up. It's going to be sold. It's going to be sold to foreigners. And the Ukrainians are going to be driven off the land. All of those peasants are going to be shafted. Well, you see. In the question of defense, let's get back to that. The Kiev regime says that they're going to give land near Kharkov, right up on the Russian border, for U.S. missile defense systems, ABM systems, and a U.S. Air Force base with a wing of American fighters to provide cover to defend the ABM, the missile defense installation. This is a recipe for genocide. And we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We had a banner unfurled by the Answer Coalition people at the White House on Thursday when Yatsenyuk was in there. I'm very puzzled by the behavior of the Answer Coalition. We of the United Front Against Austerity were demanding to know from them, were they going to do anything on Wednesday night? And they said, yeah, we'll tell you essentially at 6 o'clock on Wednesday. Then we would have been able to organize some kind of a turnout, but they kept all of this under wraps until 1 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, and then they announced that there would be a protest banner unfurled at 2 p.m. So you can't get down there from anywhere in D.C. in an hour. So they unfurled the banner. But this is a very strange behavior, which I would suggest sectarianism, I must say. As of today, that is the 14th, we want to point your attention, even though this is already, this is going to be over with by the time we get on the air, but the International Action Center, this is Ramsey Clark, International Action Center, organizes a protest in New York on Friday, March 14th, this afternoon, 5 to 6 p.m. at the CNN headquarters, 10 Columbus Circle, right, Broadway and 59th, and a march down Broadway to Fox News at 49th and 6th. And this is Ukraine, no to another U.S. war, urgent call for actions between March 10th to March 17th. And I urge people to help build these events. Attend them, sure, but also help build them. And if you come across any, please send me a notice, right? Please let me know what's going on. I will use I have 15,000 people on Twitter who are interested in receiving this stuff, and certainly some of them would be able to turn out. So wherever it is in the world, please let me know, and we'll try to help build up these protests. I went out of my way to announce a class given by Sarah Flounders of the Workers' World Party, which at least in the past had some say in the Answer Coalition, and that was in New York City on Monday, and I hope she got some people off that. So here, that's our situation. Now, the killer austerity, which I just mentioned, this is a very important political fact now, and that's just to sum it up, right? Chevron gets the gas pipelines for free. The Donetsk, Donbass, coal, and steel go to German interests. U.S. jets and missiles go to Kharkov. Gasoline prices double. Electricity goes up 40%. The natural gas doubles, and gasoline goes up 60%. The foreigners get to buy up the Black Earth region, great speculation, prenatal care and assistance with birth, delivery, abolished, no free textbooks, and all of this, right? And I think you get the idea now in terms of a rational self-interest, right? This is not just like Kremlin propaganda, as we're told, right? This is not at all the demagogy, right? It's not this alienated stuff where you have fascists who are living back in the era of Stepan Bandera. As Kovitidi, right, the Deputy Prime Minister of Crimea, says, the recent developments in Ukraine and the decisions being made have a direct bearing on the people of Crimea, who must know the truth and decide their own and their children's future in a referendum, right? Where would you want to be? Russian Federation, average income, I think, $14,000 a year. Ukraine, $4,000 a year. Not too doggone good. Here in the Washington Post of today, they actually talked to a guy, City Council of Sevastopol. He says, think about your families. Do you want to live in a prosperous country or be poor in a country governed by traitors and thugs? Relevant questions, right? And that's better than the anti-Semitism, Russophobia, we hate Poland, we hate everybody, glory to Ukraine, and Stepan Bandera, right? That's just not going to fly. And we want our nukes back, and we want Polish territory, all these voices that we hear coming from these lunatics of Svoboda and indeed of the right sector. By the way, concerning Svoboda, Chanibok, there's now an international arrest warrant for Chanibok because it turns out that Chanibok, the head of Svoboda, just like Muzichko of the right sector, has actually gone to take part in the Chechen war. He was coming in there on the side of the terrorists. Now, I can imagine some people will say, yeah, but how can they impose that kind of austerity, right? Isn't that out of the question? Well, I have here the New York Times editorial from yesterday, right, from the 13th of March, and the New York Times is demanding the full fury, the full genocidal fury to be unleashed against Ukraine. Quote, international efforts to provide financial aid to Ukraine offer a chance to fix a troubled economy. But those efforts will help only if the country's new leaders are willing to end bad policies like wasteful energy subsidies and take steps to increase imports. This means devalue the currency, because that allows the foreigners to come in and buy it at a very reduced rate, right? Bargain basement prices. And there's actually a debate about this. Isn't that great, Ukraine? Thanks to your great Maidan, your fate is now being debated here in the U.S. between the New York Times editorial page. But here we have the other school. This is now Larry Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury, finance oligarch, right? Hates women, we know him. Monday, March 10th, Washington Post op-ed. He's basically saying watch out, don't overdo it. Social safety nets need to be strengthened before subsidies on items such as food and fuel are removed, not afterward, as has been the case. The international community, says Summers, needs to understand that even when the conditions it imposes are economically rational, that's debatable, Larry, they may be more than the political process can bear. It is no use blaming the country being assisted when this results in the adoption of bad policies. This is surely a time for political concerns to trump technocrats' fears. Of course, the technocrats are the austerity ghouls, but you get the idea. And this, I think, this is precisely where we're headed. I say that if the current fascist regime of Yatsenyuk in Kiev continues on this, as he says, kamikaze, harsh course, right, as the New York Times is demanding, and as this leak from the deputy prime minister of Crimea seems to indicate, if they do that, they will blow up this entire situation. In other words, Ukraine will go into another round of complete destabilization, and it will be just about impossible for the Kiev clique to maintain itself. And I say this also because if you go back, and I wanted to devote more time to this, but we just don't have it, I recommend that you take a look at a book called The Tragedy of Russia's Reforms, Market Bolshevism Against Democracy, by Peter Redaway and Dmitry Vasilyev-Glinsky, with large parts written by me, as I have pointed out, as indeed the preface states. One of the things that destroyed the Soviet Union was Yeltsin declaring shock therapy in October 1991, and we'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. And watch out for those false flag operations. You get the whole story on my Twitter feed, Webster G. Tarpley, which you can best access through tarpley.net, tarpley.net, your headquarters to follow this crisis. Now, we've gone through this brutal, genocidal IMF austerity program for Ukraine. Certainly, if that's going to be the future, then you got to get out of that, right? You got to get out from under the IMF, and Russia would at least be some guarantee against it. What I would argue, though, is that if the Yatsenyuk, who is a complete puppet and can hardly say no, even Timoshenko could maneuver a little bit, but Yatsenyuk, complete creature of Newland, you're going to have the breakup of Ukraine, and inevitably, if the central government in Kiev goes for that. And my reason for that is, again, if you look at the Redaway and Glinsky Tragedy of Russian Reforms from the year 2000 or 2001, remember that Yeltsin in Moscow announced shock therapy in October of 1991, right? Yeah, the August 1991 attempted coup d'etat by the old KGB military-industrial complex government and so forth, the coup d'etat of the 8 or 9, how you want to count them. And at that point, that's pretty much sealed the doom of the USSR, which did not need to happen. You remember that in that coup, the leaders of the 15 republics, with the exception of the Baltics and the Caucasus, but places like Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and so forth, they supported the coup against Gorbachev. But after that, when Yeltsin emerged as the victor with U.S. help, as Glinsky and Redaway note, what happened then was the independence of these Union republics came right after the August 1991 coup, and they decided, these oligarchs in the various republics, hang on to power by declaring the independence of their republics during the first days after the coup, even though they had earlier attacked Yeltsin and the democratic movement in Russia for allegedly wanting to destroy the USSR. So there was no mass base for this. The disintegration of the USSR was not the result of national liberation of colonies against empire. Maybe in the Baltics you could argue that. But one reason was that it was simply done by the nomenclatura, right, the oligarchy, and there was no important figure who was willing to oppose that. What could have been done, and this would have been a way to keep the world from going out of balance in the way that it has, is that you could have had the USSR survive minus the three Baltics, right? Minus Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, minus Georgia, minus Azerbaijan, perhaps minus Armenia. That's a little bit less certain. So minus the Baltics and minus the Caucasus, but with Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the 5 Central Asians and Moldova, right? That would have been what remained. And the big question was Ukraine. And you'll remember that in the spring of 1991, 75% of Ukrainian voters voted to stay in the USSR. 75% of the Ukrainians wanted to stay in the USSR in the spring of 1991. It was only then the August coup and indeed the shock therapy which changed that. So shock therapy destroys countries, and what's being proposed here is another round. It's like a second round of IMF shock therapy imposed by Yatsenyuk and Nuland. And that's going to break the place up. And at that point, the pieces will be up for grabs. And this is dangerous. Now, just a sideline. When you look at somebody like Nuland, right, you wonder, where does this person come from? The Washington Post of March 6th carries a obituary of her father, the surgeon Sherwin B. Nuland. And what we find here is that this is a family coming from a very poor Jew who immigrated to New York City. His father was Shepsel Bear Noodleman, who became Sherwin Barnard. But Dr. Sherwin Nuland, who died at the age of 83 earlier this month, it turns out that the grandfather had chronic syphilis, and then Sherwin Nuland, after he got his medical degree from Yale, in the early years of his career, Dr. Nuland went into a depression so severe that a lobotomy was considered. The idea was ultimately rejected, and Dr. Nuland underwent a course of electroshock therapy. This is the father of this charming lady, Victoria Nuland. And then he went to Yale to work, and he has continued at Yale. And what he writes about is essentially what can we call it? A death cult, a Thanatos cult. How We Die is his main work. How We Die, Reflections on Life's Final Chapter, which got the 1994 National Book Award. And this is a detailed description what it's like to die from heart attack, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, homicide in such raw detail that some readers were unable to finish it. That's an obituary. I read all this from the Washington Post, Thursday, March 6th. So maybe that's some idea where she comes from, a somewhat troubled family background. Now, Anne Applebaum, Mrs. Sikorsky of the Washington Post, right, the wife of the Polish foreign minister, who seems to have been the key guy in that abortive 21st of February deal that was key in the coup, right, a coup operative. She's worried that the Kremlin is actually holding its own in the propaganda situation. And I would simply point out it's interesting that there are various voices exposing the fact that these are fascists in Kiev. Stephen Cohen, of course, brought that up against the hysterical warmonger Amanpour. Eugene Robinson in the Washington Post on Tuesday, March 11th, Ukraine's Bad Apples. Counterpunch magazine has got some critical coverage. Even The Nation goes into the dark side of the Ukrainian coup. And in Germany, apparently Die Linke, the left party, right now working with Alexis Tsipras, and we'll have more about that in coming editions. They're also putting out this line that these people are fascisti to a significant degree. And remember, the question of neutrality, right? Neutrality being argued by Kissinger, neutrality also being argued for Ukraine by Ivan Eland. And I should mention that antiwar.com has good exposure material on the fascisti, and is also where Eland puts out his column arguing for neutrality. Remember that in 2010, Ukraine voted for neutrality, right? That became a law, that they became a neutral state. And I think that's where the heart of the people are. Notice that Yatsenyuk and company put out a call to mobilize the reserves, and we're told, and we repeat what we reported a couple of weeks ago, that the turnout is like 2 to 3% of the reservists have shown up. Basically nobody. And we'll get to the American view in just a second on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Ukrainians, as just mentioned, voting with their feet, not showing up to be mobilized, right? Conscripted, mobilized, and sent to the front. They do not want to be. And that's the fact that the mobilization call coming from Yatsenyuk and the defense minister, right, and the defense council, who are basically from the fascisti, the open ones, nobody's showing up. As a matter of fact, it appears to me that the call to mobilize the reservists has now been issued a second time this past week, after being issued almost immediately following the 22nd of February coup. It's gone out again. And the news accounts of the second issuing don't mention the fact that it has already been tried and it essentially failed. So Ukrainians not too doggone enthusiastic about the idea of fighting and dying for the likes of the exterminating angel of austerity, Arsenic Yatsenyuk. Not so good. Here in the United States, got a poll, 56% of Americans, 56%, clear majority, don't want anything to do with Ukraine. But out of Ukraine is the message. 29% are tending towards the warmonger camp, and 15% don't know. Warmongers, of course, today, Washington Post, Charles Krauthammer, right, the diehard neocon warmonger, he says it's time to send U.S. aircraft, that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff should go to the Baltics, should visit Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, the four that have that share a border with Ukraine, and above all, install the ABM, the anti-ballistic missile systems. They want them, and that's something that Cheney actually proposed. Extend the maneuvers of the USS Truxtun, one destroyer in the Black Sea. That's really going to scare Putin. And then arm the junta. In other words, send U.S. weapons into Ukraine with training and advising people. In other words, like the Vietnam method. Send in advisors, send in helpers, and treat that as a tripwire. Reverse the annexation. This is harder, but anyway, you get the idea. This is absolute folly. This is the recipe for World War III. The neocons, one-trick ponies to the last. They are obviously out of step with the American people, and they deserve the hatred in which they're held. Some of them, this Danielle Pletka of the American Enterprise Institute, has come out from her hole where she'd been essentially lurking for the past several years with the possibility now that there's going to be a new war. All right, so the battle for public opinion in the U.S. Continues. The Russians have sent jets over the Mediterranean. The reports, Russia is accused of blocking food shipments to Klaipėda, Lithuania. The OECD has suspended the Russian application for membership. Just one other question here, which is there's some interesting points raised by what Putin is doing. Right? We have these theories. First generation warfare goes back to the 1600s, and it extends pretty much to the end of the 19th century, although even in the American Civil War, it's changing. First generation, line and column, musketry, things like this, cannon, but maybe not that many. Second generation is the essentially what Pétain writes about, right? Firepower kills, and that's the French approach to World War I, the continuous front. But then the third generation is the Keil und Kessel, the tank attack and the encirclement and the war of maneuver to try to take the war to the flanks and rear of the enemy. And then we have fourth generation warfare, right? And the fourth generation warfare often comes down to the question of a non-state actor and things like terrorism, cyber warfare, and there's no immediate front. Political, psychological, cultural factors loom very large. Media warfare, low intensity conflict, and so forth. Now, the question is, when you look at what Putin has been able to do in Ukraine, the question is, first of all, has he found a system which is adequate to defeat the color revolution? In other words, the essence of the color revolution is that this is fourth generation. It's a very advanced form of fourth generation warfare. And here, the Washington Post, Monday, March 10th, Molly McHugh and Gregory Maniatis. These are two advisors, have advised Georgia in particular. These are people from the Saakashvili operation. So they're obviously compromised with the fascist and warmonger Saakashvili. But what they point out is it's a mistake for Kerry to say that the invasion of Crimea is 19th century behavior. They say, no, Putin has not miscalculated. He is waging 21st century warfare. So he spent months deploying, in the past, the traditional means, but psychological warfare, cyber warfare, and then this force, this anonymous, unnamed military force, which comes forward with no insignia and then dominates the situation. Now, these characters, obviously hostile to Putin, they argue these tactics create a chaos which Putin controls, a status quo that allows him to influence the politics and policies of Ukraine. Yeah, sour grapes. That's what you try to do with color revolutions, and now with this second generation of color revolutions, right, with the fascists being prominent. So what does that leave us with? Up to now, color revolutions have been defeated, most notably, I think, the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, defeated by Hezbollah, right? The organized power of Hezbollah was sufficient to turn back the attempted Cedar Revolution, which would have been a very bad step for Lebanon. In this case, I think we might say that Putin has come upon a combination of factors which allows him to defeat the color revolution second generation, which has been imposed on Ukraine. We'll have more about that in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So we've attempted to do justice to the Ukrainian front. Again, I think that Putin has developed perhaps a method that allows him to defeat the traditional now and insidious U.S. color revolution. Some other things that might emerge from this, we'll talk about these in coming weeks. If expropriations and sanctions occur, then will this mean the end of globalization? It could. In particular, the West is gloating about capital flight out of Russia. Kudrin showing where his loyalties lie. The former finance minister that Putin very unwisely kept in that government for a long time until he got rid of him. Kudrin is basically trying to scare the Russians, saying, "Oh my God, you're going to suffer. It's going to be awful." Well, if capital flight is the problem, then capital controls are the answer. The reassertion of the inherent power of the modern state to checkmate such attempts. All right, let's look at Syria for a minute. Interestingly, the Washington Post here of Saturday, almost a week ago now, March 6th, big headline on that Saturday: Assad making the most of division over Ukraine. U.S. focused on rift with Russia. Syrian leader moves to crush rebels and win re-election. Well, utinam, as the Romans would have said, right? Magari. I wish very much that this occurs, right? And perhaps it will. That one of the problems is this illusion that the U.S. and Russia work together on these things. Well, it turns out that that's not what Washington intended, is it? The Russian elite, in particular, has been obsessed for their own narrow sort of nomenclatura, personal wealth issues. They want to be integrated into the world system. But it turns out you can't be integrated into the world system. The world system won't take you. They're hostile. And it continues the status of Russia in the 19th century. The main barrier, along with the U.S., but the really huge barrier to British and French world domination in the 19th century was the Russian Empire. And that simply is a structural fact, and the only way you can get integrated is to be broken up, according to the Brzezinski plan. And getting broken up is going to give you the kind of looting that we've just gone through. So it's better to fight back against it. Anyway, the idea here is that Assad is rolling up the military challenge posed by these various jihadis, right, by the death squads deployed in, and that he's preparing an election for later this year in which Assad will run for president and, again, quite possibly win another term as president. And this will be perhaps another example of the U.S. and the British saying, we're for elections, but not that election, right? The ones we're going to lose are the ones we're against. So this would be good news. And the anti-Syrian front is now cracking. That would be the Saudis are in a big fight with Qatar. Earlier this week, we had the Saudis threatening an air, land, and sea blockade of Qatar unless Qatar agrees to shut down the Al Jazeera television network. This is remember, the Qatar people are like the House of Orléans, right? They're the dissident. They're monarchists, but they're dissidents, and they want to take over. So Philippe Égalité was the Orléaniste at the time of the French Revolution, and we've told the story, right? He tried to ride the tiger of the revolution and ended up on the guillotine, and the mainline Bourbon were quite hostile to him. So in this case, the Saudis are the Bourbon, and the Qatar are Philippe Égalité and company, and this introduces new elements of confusion and conflict into the anti-Syrian equation. So we'll follow that quite closely. Obviously, we've been waiting for the liberation of Aleppo for quite a while. Maybe that will happen fairly soon. Now, let's switch for a minute into U.S. Domestic. Now, we've had this by-election, right, the special election for the House seat in Florida. And here, the reactionary Jolly, the lobbyist, the Republican lobbyist Jolly, has defeated Sink, the darling of the Florida Democratic Party, by about 2%. Now, this is a district which has been Republican for 50 years under this guy Young, who is now retiring. The turnout of the voters was 33%. It was a special election, low turnout, and Jolly managed to win by 2% and did not get a majority of the votes cast because there were other candidates in this. Now, what do we learn from it? I think the main thing to learn is this, that the Democratic Party is vitiated, it's flawed by its inherent inability to fight for the people, its refusal to fight for the people. Here's Jolly, somebody who comes on the scene as a privatizer of Social Security, as a brutal cutter of Medicare, an austerity ghoul, and a reactionary. And, of course, he's got the usual reactionary social issue program, right? War on women, what have you. And nevertheless, this Sink, who was, she was outspent, but still she was competitive. She was getting enough money so that her voice could be clearly heard. Jolly managed to make this about Obamacare with strident attacks, right? With, raving, the usual raving stuff about Obamacare. And Sink, what happened with her? Pathetic, right? Not even pathetic, but pathetic, right? The art of sinking in rhetoric, peribathos, going down. So Sink was in the pathetic school, namby-pamby, trimming, temporizing, and this was summed up very well by Chris Matthews the other day, right? Because she would say, well, we think we're right, but sometimes the Republicans are right. It's not all bad. In other words, a very, very weak line. And, of course, you can see what happened in the election just by the coverage, right? That Jolly was able to make this all about Obamacare, and Sink never really was able to recast it in her direction. What you needed was a strong, aggressive attack on Jolly as a reactionary, as a proto-fascist, as somebody who would kill old people, young people, with his denial of medical care and his privatization of Social Security. That guy is somebody who's been hugging the third rail, hugging it. And Sink was unable to bring this up. She needed to counterattack Jolly on Social Security, Medicare. Of course, once you say this, you can see what her problem is, right? She's running as somebody who is friendly to Obama, likes Obama. She would have been better to keep her mouth shut about Obama, but maybe that was the condition of her funding. Anyway, she didn't do that. She was unable to get Jolly on the defensive. And it reminds us of the famous dictum of Paolo Sarpi, written for the Venetian Senate 400 years ago. In politics, as in war, there is no greater misery than to be on the defensive alone. Gotta go on the offensive. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So the analysis here is that Sink ran a namby-pamby, weak, defensive campaign, and Jolly was able to run wild. He dominated her in terms of rhetoric and keeping the initiative and so forth, and that's why she lost. And I think she's probably hopeless after losing the governorship and now losing, or the Senate, whatever it was, before statewide office. Now she's lost this. Maybe Sink has gone down for the count. Now the question is, this seat will come up again, like all of them, in November. Should she run again? No, you need to get somebody who's going to fight. Or if that's not possible, at the very least, then get Sink retooled so that she goes on the attack. And this is the problem of the Democratic Party, right? That they cannot wage a powerful campaign for the people because they're so afraid of losing their funding, right? This is the post-Tony Coelho Democratic Party, right? That they're just as dependent on big money contributors as the Republicans, and they've given up their commitment to the mass organizations. And you can see this, right? This was the reason, after all that work of getting those signatures to get the fascist Walker out, you were then stuck with this namby-pamby Democratic mayor of Milwaukee, whatever his name was, who wouldn't fight for trade union rights, wouldn't fight for working people or anything of the sort. And you saw that again. The people in Wisconsin haven't learned it. The woman that they're running against Walker this time was on Chris Hayes on MSNBC, and she would not come out with a strong commitment. I'm going to restore the rights of collective bargaining and the status of union. She wouldn't do it. So it means that there is a gaping niche for a political party that would actually fight for working people, which the Democrats just structurally are incapable of doing. And you can see the other thing is Sink wanted to run as a friend of Obama. Yeah. Well, once you've embraced Obama, you've got somebody who has come out strongly supporting the chained consumer price index. In other words, he's got his own way for genocidal chiseling against Social Security. Now, he has indeed removed it from his budget, but the word from the White House is still that Obama is open to cutting Social Security. And you're gonna run the November elections. You're gonna get Democratic candidates running for the House on that. Let's cut Social Security or Medicare. Once you've said Medicare, well, what about the $700 billion that was sucked out of Medicare in order to fund the Medicaid expansion? I'm all for the Medicaid expansion, but the way to pay for it would have been the Wall Street sales tax, the 1% tax on turnover. And again, we've had all kinds of people screaming about entitlement reform. Let's go back and look at why Wall Street doesn't pay any taxes. No sales tax on the turnover, and certainly no corporate income tax, as we find again and again and again, be it General Electric, Goldman Sachs, Citibank. The amount of tax paid is microscopic, or sometimes it's even negative. Sometimes the federal government is paying General Electric more than General Electric is paying the federal government, right? Which is simply impossible. So that's the problem. That's why the tax Wall Street party. That's why it's absolutely critical to have people running for office with the Wall Street sales tax, and then in the longer term, the recovery brought about by nationalizing the Fed, forcing the Fed to finance a recovery. Now, just a couple of other things about this. The deporter-in-chief, Obama, it's true, right? He says that he can't help it, but he has brutally deported all these people. During the Cold War, I remember living in Germany, right? The question of uniting families, right? Die Familienzusammenführung used to be a big issue, right? That when you have the divided country as Germany was, you got to try to have a humanitarian commitment to keeping families together. The U.S. has no such commitment. People are simply deported. It's brutal. It's horrible. And that's your labor force of tomorrow. You better learn to develop those people and get them qualified, because that's how you're going to compete with China. And if you don't see that, you'll be speaking Chinese, and think about what an inconvenience that's going to be to learn it, right? When you can't. So it's interesting that Obama is relenting on that one after he's been bashed so much, and it shows the only way to get anything out of Obama is to bash him mercilessly in the way that the Hispanic caucus has done. Now, here's another very interesting one. When we had this last budget deal, the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill included a second round of killer cuts to food stamps. Remember, there was a round of cuts last November when the Obama stimulus plus up of the SNAP or food stamp program, when that expired last November, just in time for Thanksgiving, a lot of people had a cut, $10, $15, $20 a month in their food stamp check. And of course, that's a week's worth of food for many, many people. Now we had Senator Klobuchar, an austerity ghoul Democrat, the kind of Democrat better not to have her. She cooperated with the fascisto Republicans in this latest bill, which went through, which was that the Heat and Eat program was going to be eliminated, right? Number of states, 18 states, I believe, and a lot of them are places where it's cold, had figured out that by getting people on the federal LIHEAP program, state federal, the emergency heating assistance in the winter, if you gave somebody even a small token amount, even $1 of LIHEAP, of heating assistance, you could then get them onto food stamps. And this was then being used. Now, Klobuchar, the austerity ghoul, Democrat, she thought she was able to close that loophole, and this would have meant that a million people would have lost $90 a month in their food stamp payments. But it turns out that she didn't. She's too stupid, too incompetent, too bungling to close the loophole. And a number of states have now figured out a way to keep people on food stamps against the will of Klobuchar. She says, oh, this is terrible. This is compromising the integrity of the program. How about the integrity of people's lives, Klobuchar? How about the implications of genocide, for which you may be called to answer at Nuremberg, and maybe with outcomes that you won't like? So it turns out the person leading the charge, at least on National Public Radio, is Governor Corbett of Pennsylvania. Now, he's in deep trouble. This is austerity ghoul is him. But here he finds a way to avoid, to reopen the loophole, the Heat and Eat, and he parades himself as a great friend of the suffering masses of Pennsylvania. It's interesting. Great, let him do it. Tom Corbett, space cadet, now becomes the savior of SNAP and food stamps in Pennsylvania. Well, obviously, don't believe it and don't vote for him, but good that some people are going to be saved from starvation, quite frankly. Boehner has said that the states are cheating. Boehner is in hysterical freak-out mode. The states are cheating, and this is not what he intended. Well, thank God some people that might have died apparently won't die if this can be continued. And I guess we've run out of time for this week, so we'll see you next week on World Crisis Radio. Go to those anti-war demonstrations. Go to the anti-fascist demonstrations, Tarpley.net and Webster G. Tarpley on Twitter. And we'll see you next week. Between Klitschko, the punch-drunk Palooka, who's been excluded now by Newland and Company from the government, and the envoy of Lithuania, who was functioning as a representative of NATO. So those are very interesting, right? With Klitschko providing his bank information so that deposits can be made to his account, presumably. But the most urgent and immediate thing is hacked emails that show that these are alleged emails, right? And their validity would have to be investigated, but looks quite plausible. And this theme, whether these emails are plausible or not, this theme is highly relevant because this is exactly what you'd expect NATO to do. So what they show is the U.S. military attaché in Kiev, Colonel Jason P. Gresh, Gresh, writing emails to a figure in the Ukrainian military. This would be Colonel Igor Spied. So, Lavrov, in the course of this, referred once again to the deal of the 21st of February, which was sponsored by 3 NATO foreign ministers, and which was then promptly junked. And for the Russian position is that deal, which called for the disarming of the fascist mob of Maidan, well, that's still in force, and it's not being fulfilled. And what do you say to that, Kerry? Now, at a deeper level, the big danger. There is a group called Anonymous Ukraine. And Anonymous Ukraine have gotten a hold of various emails, and these are highly interesting. This is a group of hackers, and they say they lament the fact that Anonymous worldwide is split between those who want to take the Abby Martin route, that is to say, subservience to the State Department and cringing regurgitation of the U.S. foreign policy line. There's a group in Anonymous that wants to do the Abby Martin routine in that regard. But then there's also a group that wants to defend the actual interests of people in Crimea and indeed Ukraine and the entire region. And they have put out email in the IMF Austerity. Anybody in his right mind is going to vote to join the Russian Federation. What choice is there? And I would do that. That's quite independent of whether you're a Ukrainian ethnic or speaker or Russian or Turkmen or Tatar or anything. This is simply beyond the pale. So beware the Ides of March. That's our advice to Yatsenyuk. Now, this morning, Lavrov and Kerry have been meeting in London, and this is already a cave-in by the U.S. because you remember that earlier in the week, Kerry said, well, we can't engage in contact talks, and we can't engage in any talks unless and until the Russian Federation accepts our entire concept of what's going on and the legitimacy of the government and the illegitimacy of a referendum and the sacred borders of Ukraine and so forth. Somehow the borders of Serbia were not sacred, but the borders of the Ukrainian state, now that it's under the control of these fascists, this is now sacrosanct. So Kerry had to cave on that one because that was simply unbelievable, that you won't talk unless you get all your preconditions satisfied. World Crisis Radio, this is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C., and our motto of the day is Beware the Ides of March. This is extended to the hapless Yatsenyuk, who confabbed with Barack Obama yesterday, that is to say the 13th of March at the White House. Today is the 14th of March. Tomorrow, the 15th. The Ides of March. They're upon us. And then on the 16th, the referendum on whether Crimea will join the Russian Federation. And given the fascist gang in Kiev, and given the brutal, genocidal austerity that's being dished up by the International Monetary Fund and obediently swallowed by the puppet Yats. So he's got the U.S. fascist economic input, and then he's got his fascist base with the Svoboda and the right sector, the Yarosh Muzichko gang. This is something you want to stay away from. And of course, given those two factors, given the fascism and Protsyk, Protsyk, you get all you get the leads to these, the links to these at my Twitter feed, Webster Tarpley Twitter feed. Right, get that Twitter coming in. You'll know all these things in advance. When things move fast, it's got to be through Twitter that we keep the public informed. So the Deputy Military Attaché, Lieutenant Colonel Jason P. Gresh, who's got a State Department email, on the March 9th, writes an email to Colonel Igor Protsyk, the head of the Commission for Bilateral Military Cooperation of the Ukrainian Army. And the text goes like this. This is the text released by Anonymous Ukraine. Igor, the events come thick and fast in the Crimea. Our friends in Washington expect decisive action by your network. I think it is time to implement the plan which we recently reviewed. Your task is to cause some problems to the transport hub in the southeast, to provide the neighbors a trap. This will provide for the Pentagon and the company, CIA, favorable conditions for action. Do not waste time, my friend. Sincerely, Jason P. Gresh, U.S. Army.